My name is Sheila Lamb, and I'm with the Virginia SBDC Network. For those of you that are not familiar with our organization, the Virginia Small Business Development Center is a partnership program between the U.S. Small Business Administration, George Mason University, and local host institutions throughout Virginia. With 26 locations across the Commonwealth, we provide training and technical assistance to small businesses in their local communities. Our one-on-one advising services are available at no charge. Today's webinar, Building a Better Beverage Brand, is presented by the Virginia SBDC Network. We are recording today's presentation, and it will be posted on our website, virginiasbdc.org. Due to the large number of expected participants, everyone's microphone is muted and the chat feature is turned off. But if you have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the Q&A box. We have also enabled the live transcript function, which you can show or hide via your own meeting controls. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Virginia SBDC Craft Beverage Assistance Program Manager, Chris Van Orden.
Thank you, Sheila. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this conversation about building a better craft beverage brand. As Sheila said, my name is Chris Van Orden, and I'm the manager of the Craft Beverage Assistance Program here at the Virginia SBDC. So today's program, as always, is going to be a free-flowing discussion about how craft beverage companies can best position their brand in an evolving and increasingly competitive marketplace. You can enter any questions that you might have in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer everything either during or after the webinar. So I'm excited to welcome today's speaker, Jeremy Murrell, founder of Morpheus Brand Consulting. Jeremy has over 25 years experience in marketing, market research, and behavioral science, including 2 decades of shaping some of the world's most iconic spirits brands. At Brown-Forman, Jeremy worked on brands that include Jack Daniel's, Woodford Reserve, Old Forester, and Herradura Tequila to define their brand positioning, craft their marketing strategies, and uncover opportunities for growth. So now he works with new, expanding, and heritage brands on his own to develop compelling brands that speak to customers. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hey, Chris, how are you? Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining here today. So obviously lots to talk about here, but since a lot of this is talking about you and your experience, I'd like to kind of start off by hearing a little bit about your background. How did you come to branding, and what kind of experience do you have in the drink sector?
Yeah, sure. So I started my career mostly focused on market research and consumer insights. So I spent 5 or 6 years on the agency side, where I worked across a variety of CPG categories, quick service food, other consumable goods, and CPG. And then from there, I went to the client side and spent 20 years at Brown-Forman, again, focused on consumer insights. Worked with a lot of the different global marketing teams on the brands that you mentioned specifically. And my role was really of how do you connect what's happening in the world of the consumer to brands, and what does that mean in terms of building marketing strategy, building innovation strategy, what's the right creative, making sure that we were showing up in a relevant way to consumer segments, and connecting the dots between how you can use research to actually grow the business. So I did that for 20 years. I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky. So, in terms of bourbon has always been part of my life for as long as I can remember. And then being able to work on some of the brands you mentioned was obviously, a big deal for me. And then just spent the last year, as you mentioned, starting Morpheus Brand Consulting, where now I'm using a lot of that experience and knowledge to help other brands accomplish some of those same goals.
Very cool. Yeah. I think you've already touched on a couple of things about the sort of connection between sort of the brand and the marketing strategies themselves. We're going to dig into all that. I don't want to, get too far too fast, because it's I feel like a lot of times people think of marketing in very specific ways, right? It's like, I pay for this ad or something like that. Well, there's a lot of work that needs to be done before you get to the actual implementation strategies and all of that. And then, it's an ongoing relationship. It's not just step A and step B. There's, this sort of positioning of the brand over time. How does that change as the market changes? But we will dig into that, I promise. For now, though, I think talking about brands themselves, right, these are important assets to a company. I think pretty much everyone who's tuning in who's ever touched the, CPG or BevAlc space knows that we're well past the point of like a good product or good liquid is enough to sell a product. Those days are behind us. It's a very crowded place right now. Um, but even so, I still think that people sometimes don't place enough value in what a brand contributes to a company. So from your perspective, a person who's kind of who touches brands on a daily basis, why are brands important?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think a lot of times when you start to talk about brand or branding or even marketing in some instances, it's kind of
Hmm.
perceived to be fluff, right? It's sort of like, well, you put a name, you have an image, you put it on a bottle or you put it on a package, and that's good enough. But if you look at a lot of the gurus or some of the thought leaders in marketing, you have people like Seth Godin who would say people don't buy goods and services, they buy stories.
Hmm.
They buy magic. Or Simon Sinek would say something to the extent of people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And what they're referring to is, a brand is really the vehicle that takes your product to the next level or your service to the next level. So, there's a lot of science out there. There's a lot of case studies out there that looks at how brands become successful. How do they grow volume? How do they grow value? And branding is a big part of that because branding is half of the equation that does a few things for you specifically. It starts to make you understand and differentiate yourselves from your competition, right? So it makes you really focus on what makes you different,
Hmm.
which is important. It starts to help you understand how do you connect emotionally to consumers. Because again, if you walk into a package store now and you look at the whiskey shelf, for example, there's only 300 brands on that shelf in some of these larger stores, right? So how do you stand out? How are you connecting emotionally? And then are you building mental shortcuts for consumers to make it easier for them to choose your brand? And there's a variety of different ways that you can do that. But whether that's visual, whether that's your messaging, whether that's even something like the shape of your bottle,
Hmm.
all of those factors play a role in making your brand easier to buy. So having a strong brand and having a very strong understanding of your brand and the relationship it has with the consumer is where you start to win. It's where you start to increase those chances that you're going to be chosen over other brands when people are ready to buy. So there is some art to marketing, there is some art to branding, but there's also a lot of science to it that helps us understand why people behave they do and the decisions that they make and how you can help with that.
Yeah, I think yeah, the intentionality of that is interesting because I think sometimes people develop a brand and it hits and they don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
And like why did this resonate? How do we recreate that magic? And I think that putting in the work on the front end to right, say, well, what is my brand trying to convey? What are we trying to, what's the story we're trying to, like, what are the values that we're
Mm.
embodying through this brand? And obviously, there's, like I said, this is not like a purely linear thing of, right, there's the brand and that will help inform future decisions. But then if you have an established brand, how do you start to adjust course over time? And we'll talk about working with companies at various stages. But I think that so many people get up and running fast, or they have like a real strong vision of what their brand is early on, and then they think it's done. Um,
Mm.
and maybe they move on, and that brand may no longer fit the marketplace, or maybe it didn't resonate the way they intended. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of energy to invest in all of this before we even start putting it out in the world. So I guess, right, a brand is not just a logo or a slogan, right? There's kind of a lot to something that like to what a brand actually is. So when you're working with the company, how do you help kind of make the concept of a brand concrete in the minds of, those working on it?
Yeah, it's there. As I mentioned earlier, it's really a combination of art and science. And I've worked with a variety of different brands over my career, and different brands and different companies have different ways they like to do that. So, there are some companies that like to use a one pager that is just a list of words, right? Like these are our values. Excuse me. This is our personality. These are the benefits, and all of those things are important. So that's one way that you can do it. I've seen other ways of where you sort of write a one-page manifesto. Some people I've even seen, it's like a coat of arms. If your brand had a coat of arms, and what are the symbols that represent the brand? So, there's a variety of different ways to do it. What I have found is with a lot of those approaches, sometimes the meaning gets lost in translation. So the author or who owns the brand or who owns the pen on those exercises has a message or a language or something in their mind that they're trying to convey that doesn't always land the right way. And sometimes it's too focused on just the brand, which sounds weird, right? Because it is the brand positioning. So it should be focused on the brand, but it's almost as if it's missing context to where it doesn't come across as either believable or actionable in some instances. So while the components and the pieces I think are important when you're getting into levels of details like what is my brand personality? What are the things that I believe that help to guide what the brand does in the next steps? It misses some of that context. So what I found a lot of success with brands is working on what I call a brand narrative. And it's making sure that you understand the brand and those components that we've talked about, but it's in the context of certain areas. So those areas include your competition. So where are you currently? First of all, who do you even consider to be your competition in the competitive set? And I'll stick in the world of whiskey, but are you an American whiskey? Is that your competitive set? Do you have, maybe you are the rye whiskey subcategories or comp set? Maybe there's one specific brand that you're trying to chase down because you just think that your proposition is better than them. So understanding the context from a competitive set is really important because that gives you what's the language, sort of what are you looking to, how are you looking to differentiate yourself? Where do you really focus? The second, and to me, the most important part is the consumer. So a lot of times when we build our narrative or we talk about our brand, we talk about what we provide, but we do it in terms of mostly this functional area. Like we may be higher quality, we have better taste. We talk a lot about things like mash bills and aging, which are all important, but how do we really understand the way that our brand fits in the lives of consumers? And one of the things that I use a lot, Chris, and you may have seen this on another webinar that I shared, there's this marketing cartoon where it's an X-ray of a consumer's brain, and it's a couple of executives looking at it, and they're looking at it on a screen. And the brain is divided into pieces, and it says family, it says job, it says, pick the dog up from the vet, grocery. And the two guys are having a conversation, and one of them says, well, I thought this was a brand loyalist and I don't see our brand anywhere. Well, I think there's a lot of people that maybe sometimes think of it that way of you put it on the shelf, it's in my e-commerce, it's ready to go, they will come. Not understanding the real world of your customer or your consumers. So that bucket is extremely important in building a narrative. And then understanding culture. Working on Jack Daniel's, that's a brand that was pulled into culture and was used as a symbol of a variety of different things for people. But every brand plays a role in culture, or every brand has the opportunity to connect itself to something that's happening in culture. And maybe it's something that you're fighting for. It could be something you're fighting against. But understanding the context of not just the consumer and their world around how they're doing their day-to-day and the choices they're making, but understanding the world around them that they're not in control of, and what are some of the things that they're fighting for or fighting against, and how does your brand potentially fit into that? So I think when you look at it from a narrative standpoint and you're explaining the relationship of your brand with all of these different inputs and things, that it's more reflective of the real world. It's more actionable because it gives you more inspiration around things like your messaging or the way that you show up, or maybe even the people you work with. And it just has more stickiness to it. It's one of those things that when you give it to your partners or your distributors or your accounts and you're having someone else talk about the brand on your behalf, that story is much easier to tell as opposed to remembering what's that third value that's just, on that one pager that I'm handing off. So I have found more power in a narrative that really explains the relationship of your brand to the real world.
Yeah, I think I like the point about it being clarifying both internally and externally, both, yourself, your partners, and then the consumer of,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I used to work for a brewery and we had sometimes to say, does this feel like us? Right.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
an opportunity to come along, it might be a product, it might be a program, it could be a label, any of these things. And I think my previous company did a very good job at this because everybody very quickly knew if something felt like us. And that can be really clarifying for a company so you don't have to, hem and haw or, over something, or just put out a scattershot approach about like, hey,
yeah,
what are you supposed to be again? Are you like young and playful? Are you a heritage brand that's quality driven and heritage focused? Like those are two distinct things, and right, that can lead to a lot of consumer confusion when you're on a shelf with 300. Like, wait, is this the product that does all the crazy finishes on their, interesting grain bill bourbon, or are they bottled and bond like expert? They, very traditionalist, right?
yeah,
That's those are fine grained distinctions, but it can lead to a lot of confusion. So, um, right, all of this, right, like even if you can get people's heads wrapped around this, there's the actual work of building the brand
yeah.
too. So, given that you've helped to build or reshape a lot of brands, what does it take to building a compelling brand? Like who, it's sort of the nuts and bolts, like who needs to be involved? How should companies be thinking about like aligning processes, timelines, resources, all the sort of nitty gritty of all building a brand?
Yeah, and it is a process, and but it's one that you can scale, and it's one that you can adjust based upon individual brands' needs and resources and things of that nature. So it's not something that just because a lot of times, excuse me, when I have conversations similar to these, I'll get, well, you work for Jack Daniels and we don't have Jack Daniels money. And it's like you don't need Jack Daniels money to build something that is powerful for any brand. So I think the first step is really just as a brand owner or as a company that owns brands, you have a lot of institutional knowledge around, the history, the vision of where you want this brand to go. Most people have a mental picture of how they want the brand to live and behave and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of I think there's just a lot of rich institutional knowledge on the brand side that you can pull from. And I would argue that's where a lot of that exercise typically happens, right? This is our brand, we know it. We're able to bring it to life in the way that others can't. I think that the piece that is missing most times, though, is getting that external view. I think you can, and some of that you can do smartly. I call it the inside out approach. So from the inside, we take inventory from what we know, whether that's anecdotal, whether that's existing strategies, whether that's maybe you've done some research at some point and it's just getting us a set of fresh eyes on that to take a different look to see what might be there to use. And then from the outside, there's other things that you can do where you can do more of a digital safari on your competitive set and look at what are they doing, how are they behaving, what is the messaging that they're sharing, and can you start to deduce some of the elements of their narrative and the way that they've put their approach together. There's also this perspective, Chris, that consumer research is super expensive. It takes a long time, and then once I get it, I don't know what to do with it, or it just sits on a shelf. And we are living in a time from a technology standpoint that using traditional research methods and using AI and using some other techniques and tools that exist really starts to make it more cost efficient, make it faster, and actually, make it more actionable. And if you have someone who has knowledge of the industry, knowledge of research techniques, you can cut out a lot of that process, not in terms of making it productive and making it quality, but just making it take forever, right? To where it's not going to take you 4 to 6 weeks to do it. You can do it much tighter. But spending time with the consumer, spending time and understanding not just what they feel and think about your brand or the category, but what are the occasions that they're having that your category can potentially take part in that maybe it's not, or maybe a competitor is taking part in. What are some of their attitudes and values just about the world they're living in today when it comes to things around how they're spending their time? Do you have a brand that might be able to add some convenience factor to their world? Understanding just the nuances of their day-to-day lives. Even trying to dig into, and there's lots of different sources for this, but just what's happening in the world of culture, pop culture, just the world lens at this point. What are some of those tensions and some of those things that you can start to fold into your narrative as well? So a lot of it is just spending the time of being aware and looking outside of the world of just your brand. And there's a variety of different techniques where you can do that. But I think it's, what's important is doing the inside work first of what we know, working. And I also help work with brands to identify what we don't know, which a lot of times is equally important. And then trying to figure out how do we go solve those, to have a clear picture to make sure that narrative's got all of the detail that it really needs to make it actionable.
Interesting. Yeah. That's, I guess filling in the blanks is as important as anything else, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, right, if somebody's building that narrative then, and right, they say, okay, I want to start thinking about putting this into play, right? What kind of makes a good narrative by your standards? I realize it's a little subjective and, might be case dependent, but
no, I think it's fair because if you're going to spend the time and the energy of building it, you want it to be good, right? So I think when I think of narratives that are strong and brands that have really sort of nailed their narrative and have brought it to life in a good way, in an actionable, effective way, some of those qualities are, it has to be clear and concise. So when we talk about a narrative, we're not going to write a 15-page document about, the history of the entire brand, right? I mean, there are elements where you can talk about background and why the brand exists and how it came to be, but really you want to be very focused and clear about those elements that we talked about. So a lot of times I've been in those exercises where we're sitting in a room and we're trying to find brand values, and we've got 12 different brand values, and we're on thesaurus.com trying to figure, well, what's a different way of saying this versus that? And it's not that those are bad, because I think that's part of the process. It's just when it lands of these are our 12 values at the finish line, then you start to say, do we need 12? Like, what are the 3 most important things that we really want to be known for? We hold important. So being clear, being concise just makes it easier for everyone, because it really forces you to know, I know the brand, I know exactly what I want, and it makes it easier for other people to tell that brand story. Speaking of which, it should tell a story, right? Because we talked about the stickiness piece of it. So if I hand you a 1-pager with a list of words, you might remember some of those. But if I'm able to tell a story in a paragraph or 2 that summarizes all of the groundwork of all of those components that we've talked about, it's easier to tell at that point. So the third thing for me is this idea of having tension. So there's this thing of, again, and I mentioned it earlier, brand narratives that have a clear vision of what the brand is helping the consumer fight for or fight against in their world really starts to show the power of what that brand does. So there's some emotion there, right? And the brand's not the hero in the story. The consumer is the hero in the story, but they're choosing your brand to help them do something. So whatever it is that they're choosing you to do is really where you start to unlock that insight of, okay, how do I behave? What is the messaging that I developed? How do I communicate? All of those things start to really focus in on that tension that you're helping, because you may be something that, for example, it's when your consumer's going into battle and they need something fierce, they choose you, or you may be that thing that sort of lessens the tension in the room and makes things easier. So there's a variety of different ways that you can show up, but understanding that tension that your brain is helping with is super, super important. And it's relatable, right? The other thing about that is, and we'll talk about, I know we're going to talk about some examples of brands that have done really well, but if you write a narrative that you can share with other people, or you bring a narrative to life through advertising or marketing activation where people are like, oh my gosh, I've been there, or I know that, or I feel that, then you've done a really good job, because it's one of those things that it's that underlying emotion that you're building. And it's, I know you, I've been there, or we've been there, we can help with this. So that idea of being relatable is super important as well. So clear and concise, tell a story, look for the tension as part of that story, because all good stories, or all great stories, have that element of tension, right? And how do you make it relatable so people they can see that, oh, you understand me and you know exactly what's going on in my world.
Yeah, that's speaking of concise and clear, four bullet points. Hey, that's this isn't a
Yeah,
five-page.
I'm a fan of bullet points, right?
Here are 12 things you need to remember. It's like, okay, that's tough. But so let's say somebody, right, puts in that work, they, right, build that brand, and now we're talking about, this, how do we deploy this narrative, right? I mean, this is translating from the sort of putting in the work and now putting it into action.
Yeah. So think of the narrative. Think of the narrative as the filter that drives everything that you do from a marketing perspective moving forward, right? So if your narrative is around providing courage, right? Or if your narrative is around, my brand helps you get up and be the best person you can be that day, right? So your tone of voice, the music that you would choose to put in your marketing, or that you would play in your tasting room, or whatever, the color palette and the visual identity that you would use, you would want something, all of those things should feel encouraging. They should have higher energy. They should almost feel like, it's making me happy. It's getting me excited. Like there's a certain energy level, and there's this certain idea of like the feel that the brand has, right? The copy on the landing page of your website, would have some message. And this is, I promise you I'm in branding and marketing, but I'm going to use some really bad examples on this in particular, but it's, be your best today, something of that nature. So every small touch point that you would have for the brand starts to reinforce that underlying thing, that underlying emotion that you're trying to communicate. And you can communicate it more overtly, or above the line in certain ways, but everything that you do, those little bitty clues, they start to have sort of a compounding effect of really solidifying that shortcut in the consumer's brain of what you are. And again, there's a lot of science and techniques that we use of identifying color palettes, of identifying types of music, of identifying even the way, say, on your social media that you would shoot photography, and the look and feel of that photography can communicate certain emotions and feelings. It could even determine the types of partnerships that you have. And you mentioned this earlier. You said in the brewery where you guys said, does it feel like us? Does it fit us? You had that narrative in your head. You were close to it. You were able to sort of have that idea of, yes, this is us and this isn't us. Sometimes it's a gut feeling, but the narrative helps to define it to where you can have, a larger group of people really look at it objectively and say, is this the right decision for us? So, and if you think about those decisions, by building a narrative, by having a strong foundation, it really starts to make your marketing more effective and more impactful. And it keeps you from having to potentially go back and undo and redo something because it doesn't quite feel right. We would have conversations with creative partners at certain points where we would say, it doesn't feel like it's on brand. It doesn't feel right. But we would have trouble saying why. Like it's your gut was telling you. But once we started to use and talk the same language around some of the elements of a narrative, what you do is you start to have that common language with your partners and they understand what you mean. Right. And it's not that I'll know it when I see it. It's more of, it feels like this, it should feel like that. And then the work that comes back is closer to what you were expecting, because it helps to build that framework, that common language, that way to communicate with other people who bring your brand to life, right? Other partners who sell on behalf of you with the different functions that they have, that really make sure that you're effective with the dollars that you're spending and that you're showing up in the right way in the right place. You start to build that shortcut in minds. You start to be purchased more often. You start to sell more, and it starts to become this reinforcing element of, yes, this is who I am as a brand, and this is why I exist. So there's a lot of really good power in these narratives.
I definitely kind of remember seeing people speak about brands in a way that did not resonate. And I think we're talking about distributors or retailers positioning a brand in a way that does not align with that particular brand. And it can be very painful because they're saying, oh, this is the company that's, yeah, like they're really into experimentation and they're like really out there. And it's like, these are all extremely traditional recipes. That's not what we're trying to convey. And there was something lost in translation along the way, right? Just as a for instance, I mean, like there's a big difference if you're going for sort of playful, kind of joyful versus more of a comforting traditional thing. And if that kind of mismatch, wherever it happens along the path to the consumer, it can be really tough because people think like, hey, I thought this was going to be a really classic something, just a really high quality traditional version or whatever, right? Or if you think about like a very traditional product being packaged with really crazy youthful graphics, like, okay, well, maybe you
Yeah.
want to get young people to that, but that doesn't mean that you have to present yourself in such a way. And um, it can be really tough when it goes awry, right? And I think that people, working on their brands, like, oh man, this didn't work, right?
Yeah.
We got a lot of messages or we got bad reviews on whatever the rating sites are not because the product was bad, but because it's not what people were looking for in that instance.
Yeah, it becomes a disconnect because they expect one thing and they see another. And I just wanted to build on your point, Chris, on the distributor, using that as an example too of, especially in spirits or beverage alcohol, when you think about distributor partners and think about the number of brands that they're taking to accounts and they're responsible for, and the ability for a brand to have a strong narrative that makes their job easier, to where you have that, based on the narrative, that elevator speech that they know it, they can share it, people understand it. That starts to give those brands an edge as well. Because what you're doing is you're taking something that's marketing and marketing science and you're turning it into an activation piece that's helping your partners make their jobs easier. And especially with our distributor partners, if we can make their jobs easier, they're going to love us for that. So those brands that are able to do it, and it doesn't make the brand sell itself, but what it does is, if we have that clear, concise message that our partners can use in the different roles that they play of getting the brand to the shelf and selling the brand into accounts, our ability to do that makes our brand more likely to be chosen. If it's between you and 5 other brands and the other 5, they don't really have a narrative, or they're not really sure, or the story he's telling or she's telling is different than the one that you want told, and it doesn't match up. So narratives are not just strategic foundation marketing, they are. And it's like with any good marketing, it's what you do with it. You have to build it, you have to do it well. There's a science behind that, but the real power in it is not just sitting on the shelf, it's how you're activating it and how you're bringing it to life. And there's so many different examples of how to do that outside of traditional marketing. The distributor is just one example of how you can use that narrative to help them make their job easier.
Yeah. And I wanted to flag one other thing because we're talking about brands, and I think that it's important to say, right, this is not necessarily synonymous with the company, right? The company has kind of a brand overarching, but right, there's different product lines that
Yeah.
function differently that have different appeals. And certainly for some of these companies that, right, might have a very well-known flagship product, but you're trying to, and so being intentional about, hey, our core product line might kind of look and behave this way, but we have this other line that fills a different role that still fits into the top line, right? Whatever that brand is, right? I mean, just Jack Daniels, right? It's one of those, okay,
Hmm.
like everyone knows what Jack Daniels is, but then they have sort of brand extensions that still need
Hmm.
to fit overall, but it's does something different. And if it doesn't, right, fill a new role, then it's like, well, what are you doing here? So I wanted to just flag that because, right, there are so many companies, right, you're doing more than one thing. And
Yeah.
how do you speak, out there? I mean, I'm just thinking of things like, you said social media, right? Like, what's your tone in
Hmm.
Instagram? And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, but your labels may look different and still needs to be recognizable for you, but this product line versus that one and the packaging format, all of these things need to hang together. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And companies also, you make, and I'll just quickly touch on this
mhm,
because I think it's another thing to consider is there's two different approaches to that using the Jack Daniels example.
mhm,
And, one approach is, do you want to be a house of brands or do you want to be a branded house? So, and what I mean by that is, to your point, Jack Daniels is more of a branded house to where Tennessee
mhm,
whiskey becomes sort of the anchor for all of the other, extensions there. And they sort of behave very similar and they look similar. Although to your point, they may play a different role from a consumer perspective,
mhm,
a retailer perspective. They play a different role from the business growth perspective or the growth strategy. To where if you zoom out and you look at Brown-Forman is more of a house of brands where you have a Jack Daniels, a Woodford Reserve, and those brands sort of act independently and they have different narratives, they have different emotions, different vibes. But that is one thing, depending upon your company and how you want to approach it, you can select either one of those methods, and there's pros and cons to each one. But it is something to consider because there could be a strong narrative that is around that core offering that makes sense for the rest of the offerings that you have. Or
mhm.
you may say, we need something unique and different. So it is something to consider as brands get into that exercise and think about what they want to accomplish.
Yeah, yeah. It's there's no single playbook here for sure. And I think
Definitely not.
that goes also for the case of just what stage you're at, right? I mean, there's probably people listening in who are relatively new or maybe even sort of like pre-revenue stages, then there's established, hopefully growing. And there are even some companies that have been around for a while and are thinking about like, we haven't looked at our brand in a decade and maybe
Yeah.
that's what we need to do. So can you talk a little bit about how sort of the brand work differs depending on company stage? What's different, what remains constant?
Yeah, I think Chris, the thing that remains constant is or the components of a narrative and sort of the qualities of the narrative, right? So we talked a lot about what makes a good narrative and why it's important. So I think that remains the same. I think that maybe the objective of the brands are a little different. So you had mentioned sort of new brands. And when I talk about new brands, I would say that's anything from I have an idea, like this
Hmm.
is an idea that I have to you may have distribution, you may be on the shelf, you may be e-commerce, fairly young in your life stage, within the last 2 years or so, maybe even 3 years. So you're still sort of grinding out that brand awareness and trying to get the right touch points and get that following and start to drive trial. So for that band of example, I call those new brands. And I think that's an opportunity where you really have free reign to think about, okay, what do I want this brand to be?
Hmm.
And this is important because the sooner you figure out the components of your narrative and what you're trying to accomplish and what you want to be and how to communicate that clearly, you can do that frequently and consistently over time, and it just gives you more time to build that shortcut so people can recognize you and know what you're about. So almost think of it as, those who are in their 20s that started to contribute to their 401k at their job, they're getting that extra decade of compound interest, to help them get toward retirement. For new brands, spending and investing the time and really figuring out your narrative, understanding your consumer target and their world and how you fit into that, understanding culture. It's really, and we talk about the combination of art and science. Lots of art comes in here because you can kind of really be what you want to be, because you're not necessarily trying to overcome some preconceived notion of what people think you are. Right now, you'll have some who may have some sense, but from a grand scheme of things, you're still fairly new. So you have some liberties to make some changes and really clarify what that is. So for existing brands, what I find, and when I say existing brands, those are brands that have been around for a while. They're established in the marketplace. They're seeing some success. They have some volume, some value. But maybe you're looking to how do we continue to grow? Like, how do we activate additional growth within the market? And I think with the narrative, what it is about, if you don't have it, obviously building it, but then looking at what are some of those other opportunities where that narrative may play. So if you're thinking about what you represent and what you're about and who you're after, are there other categories that are adjacent to your core category where you might be able to play a role? Unlocking those new opportunities for growth with a consumer target that maybe you haven't thought about. This is also where you're sort of monitoring the components of your narrative, and you're trying to find maybe opportunities in culture where it makes sense for you to raise your hand and say, I have something to say about that. Right? There's a lot of conversation around this idea of brands going viral. Whatever the new trend is on TikTok or Instagram, and you see a lot of brands that are jumping in and taking part. And I think there are some brands that do it well, and I think there are some brands that don't. And there's this ongoing debate of, well, if I want more eyeballs on my brand and I can jump on this trend and more people will see it in their algorithm, then that's a good thing. But are they seeing it through the lens that you want them to see it through? Are you a brand that's jumping on a quote unquote viral trend that's comedic in nature, but you're a $350 bottle of whiskey, for example, So I think for established brands, it's looking at your narrative, understanding where you find the right opportunities to speak on a topic or insert yourself, or maybe insert yourself wrong, but maybe raise your hand on a point of view when something's happening in the world, especially around your consumer, and then identifying some of those other pockets of growth. It can definitely help with that as well. And then heritage brands, those are brands that, to your point, they've been around for a while. And sometimes I think in traditional marketing, we would call them cash cow brands, where a lot of times they were helping to fund marketing for other brands. But brands that they have a rich heritage, they have some foothold in the market, but maybe they've become stagnant, or maybe their growth rate has slowed, and they're just looking for like that extra jolt of, yeah, to your point, should we take a look at this? Like, what's really happening? And a lot of times what we find is it's not that the narrative's wrong, but maybe the component of it has changed and shifted a bit. Maybe the way that it manifests itself in the world is different. So the context is a bit different and just needs to be freshed and updated. Because a lot of times those brands are still very relevant. It's more about, are we communicating in the way and sending the message that's still relevant, or how do we refresh that? Where at the core of it and the emotion of it is still the same, but the details have changed a little bit. So it's just about making sure that they understand what's important in today's world. How do we do that in an effective manner, and just remind people, of who we are as a brand and what we can do for them. So different approaches in terms of how we would inform the narrative for those brands, different approaches in terms of how you would activate the narrative. But I would also say it's not black and white. Like, it's a sliding scale, right? There's a lot of gray there, to where, based upon individual brands' needs, where it is in its life stage, how it's currently activating from a marketing perspective, all of those can help inform and define, what's the right approach to make sure we get the narrative right.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it's not tidy buckets for sure. And we didn't even talk on the idea of like a brand refresh, right? Somebody needs a full
Yeah,
overhaul. That's probably a whole conversation in and of itself. But hey, if things are truly not working and you have to reposition or right in a serious way, that's a much bigger
absolutely.
process that is its own exercise for sure. But
Yeah,
sometimes that's
absolutely.
necessary. So I guess maybe to make this kind of tangible, can you talk about a few instances where sort of brand building and this kind of work made a real tangible difference to, right, a company's bottom line or sort of overall trajectory?
Yeah, there's two examples that I'll share, Chris. The first one is probably one of my favorite examples that I talk about, and it's Snickers. If you think about Snickers, they're a candy bar. They're in the candy bar aisle. Their route to market, they rely a lot on impulse purchasing, and that sort of thing. And I think um, they got to a point where they were monitoring the market, monitoring the environment, looking at their consumer, and they're seeing things like um, the health and wellness trends. They're seeing things like changing behavior with new generations of people coming into the category. Um, they probably spent some time looking at their existing marketing and trying to figure out, okay, is it still relevant? What do we do? And I think what they found was they weren't where they wanted to be. Sales were sort of flat, and they were trying to find a way of how do we put some more energy into this. And to me it was brilliant, I'm imagining myself being on that team and trying to decode and think about the approach of probably what they
Hmm.
went through. But they did work with consumers and talking to them about their world, and my assumption is they didn't go in talking to them about candy bars. They
Hmm.
went in talking to them about what's your day to day like, what are your meals like, how do you spend your free time. And they spent some time looking at categories around them, around candy, looking at things like snacking, looking at things like um, other types of candy, maybe chewing gum or mints, or
Hmm.
looking at things like maybe something like jerky. Um, Looking at different categories, maybe adjacent to where they were, but we're still
Hmm.
sort of close as potential. Hey, what are people actually doing? Like, why not pick up a Snickers bar? And this was around the time too where a lot of their messaging, I remember, packed with peanuts,
Hmm.
Snickers satisfied. So it was this almost very functional
Hmm.
lead. And by the way, it's satisfying. It was sort of that was kind of the throwaway piece. So I just kind of imagine that's kind of what was happening in the back room with them. But then they landed on this place with a campaign that was "You're not you when you're hungry." And what they did is they started to not reinvent themselves, but they started to place themselves in conversations where they likely weren't placed prior to that. So, and what I mean by that is they had their commercials and they were showing it. They had celebrities who were doing it. It was Betty White and she was upset, and then she took a bite of Snickers, and then it was the regular person. So
Hmm.
it's transformative. And what they found was, if I were to sort of talk a little bit about their narrative, was they found themselves as their target consumer doesn't have enough time in their day. Their days are hectic. It's super busy. Sometimes I don't even have time to eat lunch or breakfast. And by the time I get to a certain point, I start to lose it. And I'm frustrated. Maybe I have
Hmm.
road rage. Maybe I'm yelling at, somebody. I don't feel like myself. And they found an opportunity to say, oh, okay, so it's this idea of being hangry. We can be the convenient choice for you to to basically not be hangry and get back
Hmm.
to your normal self, to tide you over until you can get to dinner and get home and make it and feed the family. And you would ask yourself, well, why does Snickers have the opportunity to even say that? And that's true. I'm sure they were choosing other other choices to help them with that challenge. But Snickers probably said, look, we're convenient. It's not going to cost you a lot of money. You don't want to spend a ton of money on a snack when you're going to try to have a meal later. So we have every right to start talking about it. And if no one else is talking about it, and we can be one of the first to insert ourselves into that, there's a real opportunity there. And I think what it did is it sort of started to refocus the way people saw the brand. It was relatable because, yes, I go through that. We all go through that. You gave me a solution in terms of showing me how you can help me fight against this thing that I'm dealing with. And it's a low risk investment for me because, you can find Snickers bars in grocery stores. You can find them in convenience stores. So availability is not a problem. But they just connected the dots. They built a narrative that made the brand more relevant in the space. They made a brand that had attention, and they went head on in the tension in their activation. And I think it's something that just really unlocked some growth for the brand that wasn't really there. So I love the Snickers example because, again, I'm sure they spent tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of coming up with the idea and activating it on the back end. But it's not about the money they spent. I think it's just really smart about the creativity that they had around identifying how they can play in the world of consumers. So I love the Snickers example for that. And then the second one that I'll share is around when I was at Brown-Forman, the Old Forester brand, where I would put Old Forester in more of that heritage brand space. It's the founding brand of the company. It's a Brown family brand that has been with the family forever. And it had just kind of plateaued, and it was just sort of there. But the team decided to really lean into the heritage, lean into the quality aspect of the brand. In terms of it's the first bottled bourbon and what that means, and the fact that the Brown family put their name on the label. And, it really started to unlock this emotional sense for the brand that got some traction in the trade that led to, being used in more of that kind of classic cocktail trend that started to pop up a few years ago and really invigorate the category there. And then led to the idea of innovation and being able to stretch the brand into places that it hadn't been before. And I think that's an example of not necessarily rewriting a narrative, but being super focused on the narrative and making it a very clear to understand of why it's different, and then pulling that through to other to the activation piece and really putting some time and energy into it. So to me, that was more about refocusing and just being really tight on the messaging. But you can take an existing brand and really put some new livelihood into it through some of those just small tweaks and decisions when you look at narrative. So those are two examples I would say of how brands have taken the concept of a narrative and really brought it to life and made it impact the business.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with your experience with Brown-Forman and thinking about, right, this is what might have been considered a drawback if there's like this sort of like the new bourbon, right? Everybody's trying to go after trendy. And if it's saying like, no, this is the sort of characteristics of this brand are its strengths, and being able to take that and say, and right, capitalizing on the moment, knowing that like, hey, people are really coming back around on old fashions, Manhattans, right? Some very, very traditional cocktails. It's not going after, and like, hey, this is the brand for that. So some of it is, right, it's not even that the brand itself really had to change much. It was just hitting things at the right cycle, being able to know what's happening out in the market, and then saying like, we are a good fit for that. So there's kind of both the sort of internal shift and then the external shift. I think it's interesting. Lots of interlocking parts here to line up.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think that's a good point, Chris, when it comes to the timeliness aspect. Timeliness in terms of, by understanding what's happening in the world, you can find those opportunities, and timeliness in that it doesn't take months to activate, right? There are things that you can do in a much shorter time frame to start to plant the seeds that, hey, this is why this makes sense for us to comment on. This makes sense for us to play in this area, and we can start talking about that. And it doesn't have to be super buttoned up and 100% perfect to where you're 2 or 3 months down the road. And now it's like, well, wait a minute, there's already been a flood of people and brands that have come in and really jumped on it already. So the timing and timeliness is really, it's a good point to make on that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so much of this stuff feels internal to a company, but I mean, I'll say from experience, I know sometimes when you're running, 100 miles an hour, you're in the company, you're just putting your head down, you're constantly doing things, but taking that time to, or making it somebody's job to know what's happening in the sort of wider market where you fit in, sort of understanding of context, which is a point I think I liked a lot about, right?
Yeah.
What's happening with your competition? What are consumers looking to do? Is there a new occasion? Are they returning to old things? Are certain um, opportunities starting to shrink up these days? I mean, in the sort of everybody was looking at the hard seltzer space as a growth category.
Mm.
And that's starting to shift. You're seeing more canned cocktails now, and who knows where that's going to go, right? It's impossible to know exactly how things are going to play out, but there are certainly, even if it's a temporary thing, you might pursue some of those things, but right, while also remaining true to who the brand is overall, because it does
Absolutely.
not resonate with consumers when somebody's doing something that doesn't feel right.
Yeah, and consumers know that. Like they'll feel that. And
Hmm.
just speaking on the sort of RTD canned cocktail, that trend partially being driven by this idea of convenience,
Hmm.
partially driven by it extends the occasion for cocktails outside of your home bar or a restaurant. What are some things your brand can think about in terms of if that thing that you're helping with is this idea of convenience? How does that help you start to think through? And it may not be launching a canned cocktail. Like there are small things that you can do, that would still add value in those areas. So, again, convenience not as strong of attention, but is definitely something brands can think about in terms of that could be the tiebreaker of why a consumer would choose one brand over another.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we are coming up to the end of our time here. Before I let you go, are there any final parting words you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, just what I would say is we think about the science of how brands grow. There's really two pieces of that, and it's one is building power in the market. So being available, looking at your distribution, your your promotions, your prominence in an account or online. So you've got to be available. And the second part of that is power in the mind, where you need people to know the brand, be able to, recognize it, be familiar with it. And both of those are important. So, and what I see is a lot of time, there's a lot of energy and resources needed to get it to market and build that power in the market. And that is extremely hard and challenging. And it's a huge accomplishment, when you're able to do that. The advice that I would say is while you're doing that, don't forget about how to build power in the mind, because if you build it, they won't necessarily come unless they know you're there and they know that you're available. So really think about how you can build both parts of that equation. And if you're able to do that, it does take time, but if you're frequent and you're consistent with that messaging, you'll build power in the mind, which builds that pull from the shelf and really gets people to recognize the brand and more likely to buy it. So just remember both parts of that equation.
Awesome. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for your time and expertise here. It feels like we could probably go a lot deeper, but I know we have an hour and I want to be respectful of your time, and
Absolutely.
I'm sure everybody's got things to do. So thank you again for joining me today.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Agree. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Chris. And thanks to all who joined us today. As a reminder, you will receive an email with a link to the recording. If you would like to sign up for upcoming webinars or access recorded webinars, please visit virginiasbdc.org/training. These resources are designed to be used in collaboration with your local SBDC advisors. You can sign up for a free and confidential session by emailing help@virginiasbdc.org or via our website. We hope to see you all at our next session. Take care.